Welcome to the Golden Crane Award-winning Color Success Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Today, I have a very special guest. Joanna Carillo is the host of Letter to My Ex podcast, where writers submit letters written to their ex as a form of closure and emotional release. She's been an avid journal writer since her early years in high school and knows firsthand the vulnerability behind writing letters to an ex. Joanna has recently received the Asian American Podcasters Association Best Wellness Self-Improvement Podcast of 2021. Woo! Yay. She strives to continue creating content for listeners to share their stories and find self-expression, self-love, self-confidence, and self-worth through her podcast. Joanna, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm so glad we're able to meet.
Yay, thanks for having me. I'm so excited.
Well, I wanted to jump right in it. What led to this really awesome idea to read people's letters to their exes?
So it came from my actual letter. I was quarantine cleaning, and all of a sudden I came across a letter I wrote to my ex that was hidden in one of those secret boxes that you never look through until you start cleaning.
It sounds like To All the Boys I've Loved Before.
That's what I've heard. And I read it and I was like, oh, like, I wonder how many other people write letters to their exes. So I went on to podcasts and started searching it, and I couldn't find a platform specifically for letters to exes. So I threw the idea out to my friends and I said, what if I created a podcast called Letter to My Ex, where people submit letters to their exes? And my friends were actually like, I actually wrote a letter. And I was like, what? I'm not the only one who does this. So that kind of jump-started me into creating this podcast.
How has it been therapeutic for yourself as well as for friends and guests to go on the show and read these letters aloud?
For me, it's very, to read other people's letters, there's this kind of vulnerability I have for the writer. Like, I feel so much, I guess, empathy towards them because I understand how they feel. And it's kind of, it's like an unexplainable feeling. I feel like it's courageous, it's heartwarming, it's empowering for them. And then for me, reading my own letters, it's also very vulnerable, and it's therapeutic. It helps people find a sense of closure that I don't think they realize when they're going through the breakup.
Yeah. I imagine that word came to my mind, closure. I mean, how do you feel after reading the letter and kind of quote unquote closing this chapter of your life?
It is, sometimes I feel like it's half empowering and half sad. Like, it's a sad to close that chapter of what was and what could be. And it's also empowering when people realize that they left a bad relationship, to be like, I deserve better, I deserve more, I deserve this happiness. So it's a great feeling to read those letters as well.
Yeah, I imagine that there's a whole bunch of grief that goes in saying goodbye to somebody. And like you said, trying to figure out how you can move on and not, because you're not going to fulfill those future plans that you might have had, that idealism.
Yeah. And I know in my first letter, the interview, the writer said, I'm grieving a person who's still alive. And that one was like, that is true. Like, the grief doesn't always happen when a loved one passes away, but also when you leave a loved one.
It's still a loss.
Mm-hmm.
Any advice to someone who would like to write a letter to an ex, or maybe saying goodbye to a living person? It could even be a close friend, right?
Yeah. I think my only advice is just write what's in your heart. And I get questions like that. How do I write a letter to my ex? And I feel like with every relationship, it's so different. So every letter is going to be different as well. So I can't just be like, oh, write about all the good stuff you had. It's like, no, not all relationships have only good things. So I say, write whatever's in your heart. Like, don't hold back. Write all the questions you wanted to know on, like, why did you break up with me? Write all the good things that happened, write all the bad things that happened. But I think the most important part is to write how you are going to move on from this chapter of your life that's closing, or ways you've improved since this breakup has ended.
Well, you've heard quite a few letters. What have been some of the most impactful letters that you've heard?
Ooh, I think one that's resonated with me the most is um, I don't remember the number, but it's sunflowers, and it's about sunflowers. Well, she goes by Sunflower at the end, and she writes about how she still loves this person. And in order to let this person grow and become who they are meant to be, she has to let them go.
That's the one I love.
One was like yeah, that one just stuck with me the most. And hearing it, I like was almost to tears reading it. It was the weekend right after Thanksgiving, and she wrote it. It was the freshest letter I probably ever received. She's like, I wrote this yesterday. And I was like, what, yesterday? Like, do you need a hug or something? Like, it's so fresh. So that one was the most heartfelt for me.
Have you learned different ways or techniques to decouple in a healthy way just from hearing about these letters?
Oh man. um I think time seems to be the biggest factor, saying like, oh, it's been X amount of years, or I'll see you in X amount of years and see how much we've changed. And for me, time does. It doesn't heal all wounds, but time does help with a broken heart. And not in the letters, but I think just cutting off all communication from an ex is also a helpful way to decouple from that relationship.
What are some things that you looked for in a healthy relationship moving forward?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think someone you could trust. And I was reading something recently that trust comes from love. Because if you say, like, if you trust someone to not do something, like, I trust you won't keep the house messy, and they break that trust, it's not based on love, if that makes sense.
Can you
It's
say
more
more?
just trust on, um, I guess that's more of expectations rather than trust. So if you trust someone who you love, you know that they're doing everything in their power to love you the right way, or that the best way that they could show it, um, as well as communication. I know sometimes in the letters, it's like, why didn't you tell me this? Or
Mm.
why couldn't we talk about this? And it's like, oh, maybe if you did talk about it during the relationship, you could have moved forward. And I think it's the third or fourth letter from one of the guys. And he mentioned too, like, I know I have a hard time expressing myself and talking about relationships with you. So this is the best form of expressing myself through writing. And also too, in my most recent, not the most recent, but the interview with JR, he mentions too, communication is the best way. So I agree too. Communication and trust are healthy aspects to look for in a relationship.
Yeah, and one of the things I work with my couples on is being able to communicate about the process itself.
Mhm.
Because a lot of people argue about seemingly small things like, hey, how come you didn't put away the laundry today or whatnot? And many times it's an attachment need that is being expressed, which is like, I don't feel like you're pulling your weight or I'm being appreciated for what I do. And so sometimes getting deeper than the topic at hand is really needed.
Yeah, that's a good one.
I don't know. I just get paid for this stuff. I don't know. But I think those letters are so therapeutic in terms of looking at emotions. What is the demographic kind of the people that submit letters? Because you mentioned males are submitting letters. Do you see more and more diversity in the people submitting them?
Yes, I do, which is why I enjoy my podcast. It's very diverse, and getting letters from all over. I've received two from India, and I'm like,
That's
I
so cool.
yeah, they're my farthest from Colorado. So I'm like, wow, hi. But yeah, it's very diverse. There's a few males, females. The age range is typically 24 to 35, but I think I do have one who's a little bit younger. But also, too, most of these people want to stay anonymous. So it's kind of hard to be like, oh, this person is blah, blah, blah. And their job career is this. So it ranges from my perspective.
But I think it makes it more raw when it's anonymous too, because they can just say anything that they want and just have it all out there and put it all out on the table.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, even for me, I'm like, when I read my letters, I'm like, should I make this anonymous? Like, I'm scared.
Has any one of your exes contacted you back after reading some letters?
No, they have not. But my twin sister has submitted a few letters on the podcast, and I know her exes have been trying to figure out which ones they are. And they're like, which one is it? I'm like, I'm not telling you.
I'm like, that's like some Taylor Swift stuff where like people are trying to figure out who's who and all that. You have a twin, fraternal or identical?
Identical.
Oh my goodness. Tell me about that. I know we're on your podcast, but tell me about that. I mean, do you pick the same kinds of patterns of personalities or different ones or the date?
I think we're very different. Like, she likes the, man, how do I explain hers? Abercrombie type of model guys.
Okay.
Yeah, who are kind of like, not that great, kind of toxic. And I already went through that phase of like a toxic relationship, so to say. And then I don't know. It's very different. I don't even know how to explain it. I feel like I go for the nerdy kind of guys, and she's more like Abercrombie guys.
So, I mean, do you give her dating advice because you've seen kind of her patterns?
I do. And it's funny because I try not to give advice on my podcast because I'm not qualified to give advice, or I feel like if people want advice, they go to their friends or family and they just need an outlet for my platform. So when my sister talks to me, I always wonder, like, do you want advice? Because I'm not usually giving advice, but for her, I'm like, no.
There's a certain level of protection there, especially, and then at the same time, being a twin, I mean, you guys have been together like forever, literally. So I think there is always that protective piece to family too. That's very different than maybe reading a letter from for a podcast, even though it's very personal.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's why too people find that comfort in writing letters, because going to family and friends is a little harder when they look for your best. Like, they want the best for you, so they're going to give the advice that's they think's best for you, and it's harder to listen to it when you can't see from the outside.
Absolutely. Well, I'm wondering if we can take some time to read one of your letters on our show. I'm like super excited to hear it, and this is not anonymous, so I'm excited.
Okay. I'm going to skip the name though.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
that person can figure it out.
Yeah. Okay. How many times do I have to write a letter and end up not sending it to you? Will this be another one? Will I finally be brave enough to send this to you and your eyes be open to my reality? Yesterday, you told Peter, yeah, but it takes two to tango. And I knew you were talking to me, telling me that I'm one to agree to this shitty relationship. What is this called? A booty call? A side bitch that you find comfort and peace in? Someone you don't want to leave when you're lonely and sad at night? Always at night? But yeah, it does take two to tango. I can't blame you for the reoccurring decisions I've made the past 3 years. We're both adults. We both know this is just a tango. Yet I hate when you acted like you cared for me, when it was just a friend. And I hate that I saw through your lies and still believed you. I'm such a fool. Why? Why am I not the girl you want to be with? I'm not special enough to be yours. I'm not special enough for you. You probably know you are too much of a fuckboy to settle down. but I'm not going to put words in your mouth. I'll never know the reason why. I've just been the girl you keep coming back to. Why not me if you come back to me? Isn't there a saying, if you love someone, let them go? And if they come back, it was meant to be. Although I would not call this love or that this would ever be meant to be. But your continual returns leave me bewildered. I am constantly wasting my time with you. And I have to ask myself, why? Why do I keep coming back to you? Why can't I say no and goodbye? Why do I get upset when you end up texting me at 3 a.m., when I end up jumping out of bed to text you back? I hope that you find the girl that finally makes you settle down, that the 3 a.m. text stop, that you don't remember me and I don't remember you. I wonder if this will be our last moment together. Me and you eyeing each other for this clandestine agreement we have, knowing that this is what we unspokenly agreed on and no hurt feelings. Or are you going to text me tonight at 3 a.m. to come over because we know this is what we are?
Thank you so much for sharing that. I can hear the emotion even as you're reading it. I mean, how did it feel to read it?
It was kind of like, it took me back because this is a letter from 2012. So, oh man, 10 years ago.
I know. Happy anniversary.
And sometimes I look back and I'm like, I wish I did take that advice from my friends to be like, he doesn't care for you. He's never going to man up or leave the girl he's with or find that relationship in you. And then just, man, I remember in this letter, I remember that moment too, when he was talking to his friend and looking at me and telling me this, it takes two to tango. So it's like, it's crazy reading it and knowing that this actually happened and that I even settled for that kind of treatment or that relationship, so to say. So, yikes.
Well, I mean, again, it's very raw. And honestly, I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that because when they are in a relationship, it's easier said than done to leave it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad I did though. And I hope like that maybe someone who does hear this and they're like, wow, that's kind of what I'm going through now. It's like, maybe I should leave. Maybe this isn't worth it.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back 10 years now and knowing that, or the person who's going to look 10 years into their relationship and being like, is this person worth it for me? So, yeah.
That's huge. Well, this is just a teaser and a taste of Letter to My Ex podcast. This is a special Color Success, cross pollination, as we call it in our AAP association, Asian American Podcast Association. So, Joanna, if people want to find out more about your podcast, submit letters, where can they find out more information?
I have a website, www.lettertomyexpodcast.com, and there is also an email button on there. My podcast is also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, and Google Podcasts.
It's definitely worth checking out. Like I said, that sunflower one really hit me because it was very, very honest about letting go in order for someone else to grow. And wow, thank you so much for being on the show and being vulnerable and sharing your journey.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.